Hello and welcome to the Rask Network. What you're about to hear and see is limited to general financial information only. Please be sure to speak to your financial planner or refer to our financial services guide available at rask.com.au/FSG before acting on the information.
Welcome to another episode of the Australian Retirement Podcast. I'm here with my good friend and financial advisor, James O'Reilly, and today we're going to talk about transitioning to retirement. But James, I believe you have a good story about transitioning back from a holiday or back into the office this morning.
Yeah, hey everyone, and great to chat to you, mate. I had a colourful morning trying to get into the city this morning. I was on a train from the Belgrave line and it stopped on the way in because of an unruly passenger, and we sat there stationary for half an hour. I don't understand how it's a better strategy to, like, if you're in that carriage with an unruly passenger, it's like, great news, we've just left you in there. Oh, terrific. That makes me feel really comfortable. So luckily that was at the other end of the train. I'm not so sure how everyone navigated that.
I mean, this is probably, it was a very challenging segue for me to put in, but transition to retirement, in my experience, probably your experience as well, I'd like to know, this seems to be one of the biggest times that people seek advice and probably one of the most confusing times for people in retirement as well. Yeah. A lot of options. And as always, I think when you've got a lot of options, it's really easy to feel like there's a big difference between the right decision and the wrong decision. So yeah, it's a huge reason for people seeking advice. And I think there are so many opportunities. One of the first questions I always ask, and I think you need to ask to any client is, and for those listening, is, do you need to work anymore? When we're talking about transition to retirement, maybe we take a step back. We start talking about, and we're very bad at it. We go granular. We're like, oh, how much do you have? How much do you need? What investments do you? All those sort of things. But it's more like, do you actually need to work anymore? And I see two parts of fair enough. There's a financial question, and you and I, any financial advisor, should be able to say, yep, you're done. But more so, and this is something we talk about a lot off air, is the emotional side. Is, do you need to work anymore for your lifestyle or for your mental health and your emotions? So that's probably one of the bigger questions and the bigger areas of advice that we deal with, and guiding people through that incredibly challenging part of their life.
Yeah, beautifully said. It's it's such an opportune time to live your best life, but a lot of things surprise people, and of course we're going to do more content on this as we move through the podcasts. But there's particularly around the way that your relationships change. A lot of people perhaps
we're all important at work.
You undervalue the importance of those water cooler conversations and those relationships that you have when you don't have them anymore. It does change your life, sometimes pretty materially. Yeah, so transitioning to retirement in the financial part, we'll go through in a bit more detail, and is kind of the easy part for us anyway. But transitioning in the emotional way and how you change your work afterwards is the difficult part. And that's, there's many books on it. There's many resources, and it's very different. I think that's something we always take away. It's different for each individual person. So I'm guessing the first step you would look at is, what are your potential sources of income? Of course, if you're trying to transition to retirement, the number one objective is where's my money going to come from? Because typically a transition to retirement would mean less work. Certainly getting to a state where you can work less, and almost always it's going to mean less income.
Yeah, and it's changing from this very difficult period where you go from an active income where you're working, you're seeing money come in the door every time. You're working for that money, to a passive income. Again, the investment, the machinations of investments for that are straightforward. But the actual emotional process of, we talked about it on last week's episode as well, which was this idea that, say you retire with $1 million and you used to earn $50,000 or $60,000, your portfolio could easily fall 5 or 6% in any given, in some cases, days, if you look at previous crises. But that's $50,000 or $60,000 gone in the blink of an eye.
That was my whole year of income.
And it makes you prone to making emotional and sometimes uninformed decisions as well. And how would you go through this process with a client? So if someone turns up at the door and says, I've worked my whole life, I'm now looking to retire, where do you start that conversation?
Always by defining retirement. This is going to be something that's totally different for everyone. And some people come in with the idea of living very simple lives. All I want to do is just play some local lawn bowls, and that's about the extent of it, and power to them. And other people can't wait to get over to Christmas markets in Europe and do all sorts of wild and wonderful things. Yeah. So really, let's get granular on that. What do you actually want your retirement to look like?
And that's different for everyone. And we've talked about that in previous episodes as well. And is that just on the income and expense, on the income side? specifically?
Yeah, I think we'd always start there, because if ultimately we're looking to develop an understanding of what you're going to need to the amount of money you're going to need to be able to fund that lifestyle. And sometimes there are some hard conversations there around perhaps what your expectations are versus the problems we're going to run into if you try to live out that life.
Yeah.
But always we want people to have a really clear understanding of what their retirement is.
Yeah, I think it's considering we do look very simply, and a lot of us aren't as engaged with our superannuation as we could be. But for us, it's all about finding those potential sources of income. So will you return to work at some time in the future? Is it some additional work? Or do you have a business? Do you have other assets outside of superannuation? Do you have super? Do you have property? And then a big part of that question becomes how do you convert that, and how does that actually work is probably the big one. And I think one of the big questions that you would receive, and I get all the time, is when you get to that point of transitioning to retirement, you made the decision. Is it time to pay off your debt? Is that one of the most important things? And I think there's always a lot of feedback on either side of this conversation.
Yeah, this has changed. It's changed pretty significantly over the last few years, because only 4 years ago, we had super low interest rates, 2%, 2.5% for mortgages. And so if you're looking at this just based on what was going to get the best financial outcome, in a lot of cases, you were better leaving that hopefully small mortgage versus using, for example, superannuation money to clear the mortgage.
It's like the lowest cost debt you ever had. We always talked about that.
That's right. Absolute dream. And so if your super fund was earning hopefully 7 or 8 or 9%, something like that, and you're and tax-free if you're a retiree too, hopefully, versus the 2% you're paying in your mortgage, you were making money by not clearing your debt. We're seeing that change, of course. Suddenly we're looking down the barrel of realistically 6.5% interest rates. And so the margin has become a lot tighter to the point where the focus, as far as we're concerned, is actually more around how the individual feels. Like, how are you feeling about the idea of still having a mortgage in retirement? Now, if your super fund is tax-free because you've, for example, set up a retirement pension, or you're going to, and then the returns of the fund over the long term are going to be 7 or 8%, and you're paying 6% in your home loan, you're actually making more money by not clearing the home loan. But again, how do you feel about that? How do you feel about the fact that you've got a home loan, which the amount never changes and it is always coming at you, versus the peace of mind of just saying, well, that's cleared. My cash flow now is my expenses are much lower, which means everything settles. And I think there's a lot to be said for that.
Now, we have a lot of discussions about that at the moment, where people own an investment property as well as their principal residence and still have debt. And the question then, or the answer becomes a lot more straightforward, that in most cases, most people want to be not necessarily have no facilities, but debt free.
Yes.
So still have a facility open that you can use to fund different things that you need to do. Could be loans to children, could be weddings. They're getting more and more expensive for those contributing. But it's very much about keeping your options open. And in most cases, that they say rent money is dead money. I don't really believe that, but I feel like if you've got the ability to pay off your mortgage towards retirement, it is interest money at 6% is dead money. Hopefully I'm not quoted too closely on that. I think the big questions people are going to have is, what are the actual mechanisms to go to transition into retirement? And this is where we get into the nuts and bolts, and how do you flick these switches that then allow you to draw on different assets? So I think let's start with just superannuation. And what's the most, I think one of the big question would be, when are you retiring? And why is it important when you retire? And I think maybe it's worth looking at preservation age. Mm-hmm. What does that actually mean?
That's changed too, hasn't it?
Exactly. Yeah. Everything changes.
Luckily,
they say that one constant is change.
Well, let's start there. Great point. When we talk about preservation age, that is the age with which you can access all of your superannuation. And that age has changed. When we started advising, that was mid-50s, 55,
I think it wasn't it?
And then gradually that...
We're quite old.
Yeah. We're getting there. And then gradually that has moved toward 60, and it is now sitting at 60. And what that means for simplicity is that if you were to retire, if you said, that's enough, I'm going to quit work and I want to have full access to my superannuation, you need to be 60 years old before you can do that now.
Yeah.
And having full access to your super adds a huge amount of benefits, which I presumably will speak to here too.
Yeah, and why does that matter? Well, like, what do you actually do at 60 years of age? What's the switch? What's the advice? General advice only, of course. And this is, a lot of people do this on their own, and I know there's a bit of data that says not enough people are making this switch.
Well, meaningfully, being able to access your superannuation means that you've got this hopefully large income stream available to you that wasn't available before. And so by extension, it gives rise to a little bit more complexity if you're looking to retire before 60. Because if you're 55 or 57 and saying, okay, that's enough, great. The next few years, you're going to have to self-fund without your superannuation supporting that in most cases, albeit perhaps some support. And so the flow on of that is that the composition of your assets is going to be different if you're before preservation age. If you've got all of your money in super and that's been your strategy for a long time, well, then retiring at 57 is probably conflicting with that strategy.
Exactly.
And then alternatively, if you're from 60 onward, now you've got access to this really meaningful, hopefully really meaningful amount of money that's going to enable you to financially support your retirement.
I think that's one of the big ones as well, because we talk about all the time that the best place to have your money in retirement is in superannuation. But we had asterisk. I had a conversation with a client this week who is exactly that position, 57. We had talked about significant contributions in the next 3 years, but was also worried that work may not be there and she may lose her job in the next few years, in which case all that money would then be preserved and unable to access. So this is why this area requires advice, whether it's talking to your super fund, talking to your advisor, or talking to accountants can help in some areas of this part, but seeking advice at this point, because there are a lot of kind of tips and traps. But sticking with super, so pensions. How do I start a pension? Does it just happen? I assume it just happens.
Just click your heels and
I'm playing devil's advocate here. So
the truth is that starting a pension is not very difficult. I think a lot of people dial up the complexity of that. The challenge around starting a pension is really around the finer details of how much income am I going to need and what frequency should I take my pension and some of those things. But for most listeners, you're likely to have superannuation in what we call an accumulation fund. So that might be with an industry super fund, it might be with a retail fund, and they will have a pension option available. And so normally you could do it online, you would log in and you could go through that process, but alternatively you would reach out to them and say, I've reached my preservation age, I'm over that age, and I've met what we call a condition of release, and that's a very magic series of words that we'll talk about shortly. I've met a condition of release, which means I'm able to access all of my superannuation. And as a result, I would now like to convert my superannuation from an accumulation fund into a pension fund, more specifically an account-based pension.
And technically with an industry fund platform, like a Colonial First Aid or a Hub24 or any number of AMP, you actually it's a different product. A pension account is a different product. It is an application form and a full process.
Yeah. The way that I've always described it, and because I just said it's a simple way, is that your accumulation fund is an account that money can go into, but not out, with some rare exceptions. Whereas your pension fund, you should really perceive as the money goes out, but you can't contribute to. So you can have circumstances where you might meet, as we talked about before, a condition of release. You're able to access all of your money, so you set up a pension. But if you still want to work part-time and you're getting, regular super payments from your part-time employer, well, you're going to need both. You're going to need an accumulation fund to receive and a pension fund to pay. You will need both. So that again, there is some complexity there, but setting the pension fund up, that action itself is actually pretty straightforward.
And there's a massive benefit. I read I think it was by could have been Professional Planner, so one of their publications. They've got a research, the Connexus Institute, I think it's a research institute, that said there's a massive difference. I think it was something like 50 or 60% of people in over 65, so I have met a full condition of release, we can go into that a little bit in more detail, had not commenced a pension from their industry super fund, a significant proportion, whereas those in SMSFs were at a much higher level. So, and this is based on if you're over 60 or 65, you do have access to your super, but so many people had not commenced it.
That's tragic, isn't it?
We know we know the benefit. Literally, your entire balance up to 1.9 million now, you can put into pension phase, and that becomes completely exempt from tax. And then the income you're taking out once you're over 60 is also exempt from tax.
Yeah.
We explain this to clients, and I feel like they're surprised and they think it's illegal.
There's some sort of magic. Yeah.
So I put money in and don't pay tax. I don't pay earnings, and I take money out and I don't pay tax. That's exactly right. And that's what makes it the best structure for generating and drawing your retirement income.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I remember a few years ago being asked by a prospect, the observation was financial advisors, there's always, as you get to retirement, super, and that's why.
For good reason.
Yeah, the answer is that there's just nothing. There's
a bit more and a little bit more value we can hopefully add around that. There's another thing that is talked about a lot but isn't as relevant anymore, which is the transition to retirement pension.
Yes.
And that probably relates to conditions of release as well.
Yeah, that's right. So a transition to retirement pension, that is a pension that you can commence without meeting what we call a full condition of release. So instead of being, let's say, fully retired from age 60 or turning 65, which enables you to get access to your super, with a transition to retirement pension, you can actually commence that and take only 10% of the balance a year, a maximum of 10%. And it's designed to be true to label in the sense that you're transitioning to retirement. And the thinking is that, all right, well, I'm now going to reduce my hours at work. And so I'm going to need to fill that income somehow, that income gap. And so a transition to retirement pension is different to an account-based pension. It's a mini pension, and it's designed to make sure that the money you withdraw will supplement any lost income that you have as you step away from work.
I think there's one big difference, isn't there, around tax?
Yeah, that's right. Well, the internal tax rate is no longer 0%. It's still 15%, which it is for all accumulators. So as a reminder, if you're sub 60, or as you were talking about with this research, if you're over 60 and you haven't done this yet, or over 65 in particular, then when your super fund releases its annual report for how it did that year, it's going to say, hey, everyone, we had a good year, for example, and we returned, let's say for simplicity, 8%. And that return is net of fees and taxes. Now, the pension fund representative is going to rock up right behind them and having had exactly the same investment allocation for the entire year and say, hey, everyone, the returns for the fund were 9% net of fees. And the difference is that 15% tax isn't getting applied. So it can still be beneficial. There was a time, it's getting a while ago now, maybe 8 years ago or thereabouts, where you did have that 0% tax feature. And that just made transition to retirement pensions the most incredibly beneficial structure.
Massive. You were just getting tax deductions, taking money out up to 10%.
It was so good.
That was incredible. I think one of the interesting things about pensions, and probably the misunderstood parts, is that the value of your pension is based on investment performance, as you were kind of alluding to there. Mm-hmm. That this is a defined contribution in Australia, whereas historically it's been defined benefit, where you got a guaranteed pension. So your pension is based on the value of your investments each year, which is based on how much you draw, but also what the markets return.
Yeah.
That's why investing and being engaged with super is so, I think, incredibly important at the moment.
Yeah. And particularly, just to lean into that, particularly in terms of volatility. So if you consider that you might have a retiree might have, let's say, $500,000 in their pension, and let's say they're withdrawing $50,000 every year. And they're hoping that their pension fund grows a little bit to offset that 50,000, and that the money lasts a little longer. Well, if you had a really, really poor year, your GFC.com crash, COVID-19 type crash, where your balance goes from 500,000 down to 380,000, for instance, that $50,000 that you're withdrawing is now a much larger amount proportionately. And so that actually can have a really erosive impact on your long-term savings.
And this is that challenge of going from active income to passive income. And it's almost this leap of faith, knowing that your portfolio will be able to generate an average return if it's balanced growth, let's say it's 7 to 9%. And you have to be confident that you'll be able to draw enough income from that and draw that income regardless of what the government tells you.
That's right. Yeah. And there have been, for those of you that recall, there have been some times where the government has intervened to try to soften that effect. If we think about during the COVID-19 fall, and it also happened during the GFC, there's a minimum pension amount that you need to withdraw, which is 4% if you're above 60 or 5% of the balance if you're above 65. But the government recognised that some people's super balances have absolutely crushed or been crunched here, and withdrawing 5% might be much more erosive. So they actually halved that limit. So it became 2% and 2.5% respectively, to ensure that people could leave the balance inside super, perhaps reduce their expenses and try to protect that balance until the market returned, grew and we're back in that position where we're withdrawing it.
If they didn't need it. I think that's always, and I have so many conversations around that, which is just because that's what the government says, it doesn't, if you need more, you should be drawing more, and then we find other sources. So maybe a good extension of that is, what do you do if you retire before 60? How do I pay for my how do I pay for my lifestyle if I want to retire early? And we have questions come through regularly, which is, younger people in their 30s and 40s. Let's call them young.
Definitely young.
Building an asset base outside super, which then has capital gains. So what are some of the things we need to consider when we're retiring a bit before 60? We can't quite access our super, and how do we go about that?
Well, you said it before, you mentioned capital gains tax. The money's going to be invested most likely in a structure, or whether it's in your personal name or in a family trust, it's going to be invested in a way where tax is going to be a real consideration. And so assuming that you're not going to work again, that may very well mean that your taxable income is pretty low. There might be some income that's coming from your investments and the like. We certainly want to make sure that we've got a reasonable income or a reasonable asset base outside of superannuation. And that can come a number of different ways. That could be because you've got a huge amount of cash from whether it's an inheritance, or alternatively, you might have been saving your pennies for over a really long period of time. Or alternatively, it could be a case that you've got one investment property which you've pretty much paid off, and I want to retire at 57. Okay, well, given that all the money's in one investment property, we're probably going to have to either sell that investment property or draw down on the mortgage against it or something along those lines. So super really is out of the equation at that point. And so we're going to look at all of your assets, but ignore the superannuation. Now, because we don't get those beautiful tax benefits that come with superannuation at 57, now we are going to have to consider tax and what are we selling and when are we selling it? And then what are the taxable implications of that?
I think one of the things we forget about when we're younger and investing is that
you keep pushing this line, mate. I feel like you're at the very beginning of a midlife crisis here.
I think one of the big assumptions we make is that we're going to be paying the same tax when we retire. But once you've stopped working, your income is no longer there, so your tax rate actually falls significantly.
Yes,
and capital gains, you don't have. We apply the tax rate we have now, not the tax rate we have in the future. So I think it's always. We talked about this last week. It's that immediacy bias that you're worrying about today's impact, but not really considering in great detail what it will look like in 20, 30, 40 years from now.
Certainly.
Depending on how old you are.
And to add to that, I'm sure you would have had heaps of times where someone comes in this situation and, your mind quite quickly as an advisor goes to...
I love complexity.
How can we start releasing these funds and not have this walloping amount of tax to pay in any financial year? Yeah, it's a huge focus.
And it's probably pivoting beyond just transition to retirement, but is it worth going into the age pension, how that's changed? I think a lot of people historically saw that as a source of income in retirement, but it's getting harder and harder to get.
Yeah, it is. But the age pension kicks in from age 67.
67?
That's changed. Yeah.
I didn't know that. I was acting surprised.
Yeah. It was 65. Similarly, that's gradually moved out. And the thinking is that Australians are working longer. That and the fact that the government doesn't particularly want to be shipping pensions to people, as much as possible, you want to try to keep a lid on that. And so that again is a very significant age in the same way that age 60 is significant with respect to when you can access your superannuation. 67 is a really significant age in that depending on your assets, that can unlock another income stream, which is your age pension. The age pension exists for most Australians, not all. I think from recollection, to be on a full pension, if let's say you're a single person, you really need to have your overall assets, not including your home, if you own a home, need to be about under $315,000. Couple, it's about $470,000 in that sort of zone.
Yeah, exactly.
And from there, it starts going down. You don't get full pension anymore. And then if you're above $700,000 as a single person, you get no age pension. And if you
just over a mil,
a couple,
1.045, 500, and obviously it's index, so it gets even more complex, but your house isn't included.
That's right.
So I think this isn't a transition to retirement mechanism. This is an in-retirement mechanism. And that's, I think, one of those areas where extensive modeling comes in, that you start your retirement in a certain position, and depending on how investment performance goes, spending goes, this becomes an option later on in.
Yeah. Yeah, and it is really significant if you can utilize it. Consider, for example, that you might want a modest retirement, which for simplicity we'll call, let's say, $60,000 a year. If we're taking $60,000 a year from age 60, for instance, you're going to have to self-fund all of that $60,000 a year, and that's a pretty significant amount of money to be taking from your assets. If you cross that barrier of age pension, and let's imagine that, for example, you and your partner are now eligible, and you combined get $20,000 a year from the age pension, which is not the max. That's a reasonable amount to be receiving. Well, now you don't have to find 60K anymore. You only have to find 40. And so the flow on in terms of how erosive that is on your entire savings balance, it really does move the needle a great deal.
And it can be used in situations where couples are at different ages as well.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Can you speak to that for a moment?
I could definitely speak to that. So there is a slight benefit in that if you are under 65 years of age, or I think it's actually age pension age. Yeah, if you're under age pension age and you haven't commenced a pension from your superannuation assets, that your entire super assets are excluded from the assets test of the calculation for the age pension. So we talked about 700,000 and 1.04 million as those caps. So where there's even it doesn't even have to be a significant age difference. It could be as just a couple 3 or 4 years. You can actually maximize your pension legally and according to all rules for that period of time. But if there's even bigger gap, it can be. I mean, it's really only down to 60 these days, because there's only a 7-year period through which you can use it. So, but that can help, and that's probably a trick that can help in terms of maximizing and settling that transition to retirement period.
Yeah, hugely. And without getting too granular, we've got a real life example of this at the moment with one of our members who. He's 68, she's 62. And over the last few years, we've been essentially stripping all the assets out of his superannuation and then putting it into hers. Yep. And so his super balance has fallen significantly. Hers has grown. But because her super balance is in an accumulation account, not pension, as you mentioned, it's exempt. Despite the fact she's over 60, it's not counted. She's under 67, so Centrelink doesn't count it. So because that's off the table in terms of the tests, they're getting a really, really healthy amount of age pension. Now, she's over 60 and she has retired, which means that she can actually still access her super if she needs. So we're ticking a lot of boxes here. Yeah. So
that's our advisors, that's why you're paying for advice. That's where, our real quantitative value is coming from financial advice.
Certainly. And it takes some time to plan for too. So do consider that if there is an age gap between you and your spouse and there's a likelihood that you'd be eligible for age pension, do get some advice.
The earlier you come in, the better.
Yeah, sometimes it can truly be worth $20,000, $25,000 a year.
I think there's probably 2 areas we can round out. One, I'm going to put it bluntly to you, residential property in retirement or transition to retirement. Yes or no? You can have it depends.
Yeah,
I'm not putting it in depends in there.
No, unless it forms part of a bigger portfolio. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think we're seeing it a lot, and this is more probably like, is anecdotal the word, like in evidence from more and more clients coming in, that the challenges, falling interest rates and increasing property price to offset the low income that you get. But once you get to retirement, you want resilience in the income you're receiving. You want in my view, you want a more diverse range of sources of income, and property is incredibly challenging because it's such a large asset. You single tenants, it's actually a depreciating asset. And I own property, so I'm not just anti-property, but as a retirement asset, it's challenging, and it's generally in a fully taxed environment as well.
Yeah, spot on.
Particularly if you're in Victoria,
especially. Just to be clear on that one, it's not to say that immediately before retirement you should look to sell your property. In a lot of cases, you might determine that if you were to do that, hey, you're better waiting until you're retired because your income is going to be lower, and that means the tax is lower, just as Drew mentioned before. But if we're taking a long-term view as to how well a single residential investment property is going to suit and support your retirement needs, again, unless it's part of a bigger portfolio and you've got a lot of liquidity elsewhere, you can run headfirst into some problems there.
Yeah, I think one good final question before we wrap up is, I've retired. Do I just buy 100% term deposits? Should I, or more broadly, should I be changing my super assets or my investment allocation at retirement?
I don't think so.
I love it. Depends.
No, I'm not. I'm not. It depends. I don't think so. And the reason why I don't think that you should be changing your retirement allocation as soon as you retire is that should have been done in the lead up to retirement. For example, the risk that exists when the day that you've retired is ultimately the same risk that existed the day before you retired. It's certainly true that as you get closer and closer to retirement, the composition of your assets should change. You should be looking to hopefully reduce risk and ensure a smoother ride. The exception to this is around specifically income. Does my current composition of assets, whether that's in the super fund or personally, does that support my income needs and do that in a sustainable long-term way?
Yeah, 100%. I have to agree completely with that. And I think one of the big ones is you should be transitioning your assets over time, as you were mentioning, and in the lead up and then into retirement, but not as soon as you retire. And I think one of the big things we forget about when we retire is this: what are your needs and expectations versus what you have. And in some cases, we naturally assume we should take less risk when we get to retirement, but for a lot of people, they actually should be taking more risk as they get to retirement. I had a conversation with a client about that yesterday. Too diversified. So I think it's always a balance, and there's no simple rules. It doesn't happen immediately as you finish. And I think it has to be transitioned and well considered and subject to frameworks, I think, for a successful retirement.
Can I lastly, I'd love to dial into one little part of that, which is around the idea of having enough income. Look, if someone has a superannuation fund of $500,000, you might be thinking to yourself, all right, well, I need, for example, $50,000 a year of income, but I'm not getting $50,000 of income from my super fund. But once you're a retiree, you don't specifically have to get that in paid income and distributions. Can you speak to that?
This is one of the biggest mistakes and worst investment decisions we see. Sometimes I lack opinions, and this is one I have a pretty strong opinion on. It's this obsession with ensuring the income that you want to draw is in line with the income that your investments are producing. And you and I know, everyone in that's invested before knows that investing in assets that only provide income, they're generally depreciating and they don't grow in value, which means in circumstances like now, your income hasn't improved as the cost of living has gone up either. So I think for us, it's about disconnecting the income that you have from the income that your portfolio is producing and ensuring what you're drawing is a sustainable level of income for the portfolio, the returns that you should expect from historical data for your portfolio. So in our experience, we've seen in the first, say, 10 to 15 years, called the golden years of retirement, people basically spend both their, slight plug there.
Yeah, we're laughing because you've got this bloody great book called The Golden Years, so it's come up again.
It's actually not in there. This quote wasn't in there. So, but basically in the first 10 to 15 years, we find most people spend both the growth and the income, as you're talking about. You're drawing 50,000 from 500. That's a 10%. You're probably spending the growth, the whole return. In the silver years after that, when you start traveling less, you're less mobile, that drops to about 70%. So now you're only spending the income and it's starting to compound. And after that, it drops to about 50%. And now you're not spending all the income or the growth. And that's, I find that could be why so many people end up with large balances in super when they pass away and pass it on to their children. Mm-hmm. But I appreciate you putting me under the microscope.
You're welcome. But I'm going to do it again, actually, because I'm going to ask for for one tip. If you're listening to this and looking to transition to retirement or starting to think about it, what's the one thing that you would say to go and do?
It's all about commencing that pension. I think that's just such a simple one. If you're over 60 and you're not age pension eligible, looking at commencing a pension as soon as you possibly can. The tax benefits are just so significant.
Mm-hmm. Yep, well said. For me, I would say that I would encourage that you start by giving some real thought to what do I want my retirement to look like? How different is it going to be to the life that I have right now? And therefore, how different are my expenses going to be? the more that you can lean into that, the better equipped you're going to be to understand all those important questions around when can I fund this? When can I afford to do it?
And thanks for joining me again, James. And we'll be starting some kind of not live Q&A, but Q&A from various sources. So please send questions from the community through our emails, which are all in the show notes as well.
Yeah, thanks, mate. Thanks, everyone.
Good to be here.
Over and out.
Thanks for watching this video on the Rask Network. While you're here, don't forget to like and subscribe so you can get videos each and every day on business, finance, investing, and so much more.